Hey, this is Alex Bryan. Appreciate you all coming on the webinar today. We've got a very good turnout, interesting topic about setting up your company's operating structure in Mexico. We've got a pretty great list of questions today that we got from a lot of the registrants, and very much appreciate you all coming on, the number of people that came on. The way we do these sorts of webinars, for those who are not familiar with it, the part 1 through 4 is going to take about 15-20 minutes, and then we're going to spend 40-45 minutes on the Q&A session. We got two great speakers today. We'll get into it, and really it should be a discussion for all those who are able to attend and signed up. Thank you very much. If you've got questions during this, please go to your control panel, type in the questions, and then we can ask them during the speakers while the speakers are talking. I'll give a brief introduction of East West just so you understand who we are. East West was started in 2005, so we're 19 years old, based in the U.S., China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and then also Poland, Central Eastern Europe. The team we have are all individuals who have run U.S. multinationals on the ground in these different markets, and we focus really only on 4 things. The first is global manufacturing and supply chain footprint. You can see that the subsets underneath that. It's everything from global site selection to plant closures, relocations. A lot of it is people are trying to relocate their manufacturing footprint because they know the tariffs are coming. They want to get their supply chain and manufacturing close to their customer base. So quite a bit of that is on coming up with a strategy, excuse me, and then executing that strategy. Second area we get involved in is operational and commercial performance. It's obviously heavily due diligence work, and also heavily working primarily with China-based manufacturing plants of U.S. companies who have found that their China operations, they haven't been there to the same level of degree they were earlier. Therefore, a lot of them have found the increases cases of fraud and corruption, and they need our help to turn that around. Third area is supply chain, which we'll be covering a lot today. That's everything on supply chain and identifying, qualifying suppliers, transitioning suppliers, global relocation of suppliers, making versus buys, doing investigation of suppliers. A lot of this is being driven by what's going on the ground in China. And then third, human resource risk management. And that's primarily, we do a lot of executive search work, and we do a lot of interim general management where we're asked to go in for a period of 4 to 6 months to help turn around a facility and find permanent general managers or bring on an interim HR director for a period of months for a company that has lost theirs. As we talked here, the companies we're located in the U.S., Mexico, Central Eastern Europe, China, and all of Southeast Asia. Here's just a brief sampling of the client base of East West. So on the webinar series, we've got 6 of them that we're doing in November and December. Today is the second one about setting up your factory in Mexico. If any of these you want to join, please feel free to take the invitation and sign up and attend. The third area is introduction speakers. I'm going to briefly introduce Dan McLeod and Jacob Miller and ask them to give a brief background on themselves. Dan, if you'll start us off.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dan McLeod. I'm currently based in the U.S. But previously lived and worked in China, Southeast Asia for 21 years. My background originally was in engineering and worked in process engineering roles and operation management in the U.S. And then in Asia. I went there initially to oversee the design and construction and hiring, staffing, and startup of a facility, and continue to do that kind of work there for the next several years. So it was oversee of large capital projects for design and build for company, also running of operations and supply chain work, identifying suppliers and extending supply chains into the local region. And since been working with East West for the past 6 years, in addition to projects in Asia, I've been doing work in supplier identification and transition in Mexico, site selection and factory setup in also in Mexico and in Europe as well. So, Jacob?
Hello, I'm Jacob Meller. I have been in Mexico. I was in Mexico for 10 years, and I've been also in Asia for 20 years, doing lots of things around supply chains and operation management, helping clients set up factories, doing interim management for different factories, and also building supply chains and localizing supply chains in different areas. Also, my background, same as Dan, came up through an engineering background. Originally in Mexico, doing a lot of things with technology transfer, and then got more into interim management with managing facilities that were having problems, and then got more into setting up new facilities after that.
That's great, Jacob. Thank you. Dan, thank you. So we're going to now go to the next section about manufacturers relocating out of China. What are some of the critical considerations? And this is really being driven by a fair amount of the work we're seeing that we're doing on the ground in Mexico is being driven by companies relocating out of China. That's posed a different set of issues and a lot of opportunity. People are trying to move beyond, get away from the tariffs. It's a pretty interesting situation. So Dan's going to talk to us briefly about what's going on in China, and then we'll get into the Q&A session. Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Sort of as background, and just to summarize where we've come to over the last couple decades. Certainly in the 90s and early 2000s, companies were setting up in China for a variety of reasons. In some cases, it was to take advantage of a lower manufacturing cost, particularly around labor, and that started to increase, and we started to see double-digit wage increases starting in the early 2000s, and it's continued now. So that when you look at costs, labor costs, and management costs in China now, that gap is closed between China and certainly other developing economies. Over the same period of time, the regulatory complexity, the number of regulations and the enforcement, and sometimes selective enforcement of them, have made things more complex. Increased domestic competition is certainly something that manufacturers struggle with. Many companies went to China initially because they had a unique product or a product that wasn't available in the marketplace. They enjoyed that situation for a few years typically, and then through improvements in their competition or leakage of their technology, they found that they've got more capable domestic competition, and prices have dropped and a lot of value is taken out of the marketplace. About 6 years ago, China 2025 policies were promoted, and this is essentially establishing strong manufacturing position, national champions in a number of higher technology manufacturing sectors, and with that is a mandate for state-owned companies to buy domestically where possible, and that's created additional pressure. Trade tariffs have been with us now for 5 years or more, and it doesn't look like they're going away, and so that's increased costs for both purchasers and sellers, and so companies are continuing to struggle with that and generally have eroded margins. Only part of that cost could be passed on. And then with COVID, we saw disruption supply chains. We saw how fragile a global supply chain can be, and with people getting not just only disruption in their supply, but international logistics costs being prohibitive. And in the last 2 years, the domestic economy in China has been a very difficult situation where there's extra capacity in the marketplace and deflation to some extent, which is creating a lot of anxiety and concerns in that market. And if you're selling into a domestic market, a lot of pressure on your prices and your margins there as well. So East West surveyed 150 manufacturers operating in China, talking about their view of the situation, their plans for further investment in China, or are they looking to invest outside of China? And what we found is nearly all companies were evaluating options, and in some case that would be to enact the China Plus One policy, where they were looking to diversify a manufacturing base beyond China, and in some cases taking more serious looks at shutting down and relocating. We in the destinations were primarily the 74% in Asia, with Mexico a strong second. And in Asia, Southeast Asia initially, in the last year or two, India's become a place of more interest for companies look to diversify in Asia. And again, as I mentioned, Mexico is also very high on the priority list.
And just for those people who are counting, our math is not that bad. Those numbers come up to more than 100%. That's because we gave the 150 companies, those CEOs, the ability to mark more than one area. All right. So now we're going to move into the Q&A session. This is the core part of our presentation. We've only used 12 minutes, so now the interesting part comes. So we've come up with, we came in with a number of questions, and we had some of you registered who also brought additional questions. So we want to kind of keep it focused. You remember from the slide invitation, right? We talked about who should attend. It's those who are trying to face profitability or expansion chances of manufacturing in the U.S. and looking at Mexico as an alternative, or it's those who are relocating from China to get away from the tariffs. Obviously, the election last Tuesday has had a huge effect. We've now got a lot more companies who really have made the decision they've got to do something because of tariffs, and now they know they're going to get worse, and they know they're coming, and they're coming pretty quickly. So Mexico's taken on an added level of importance, whether you're sourcing, contract manufacturing, or manufacturing there. So the ones we decided to attend are all those who want to look about relocating manufacturing, look about establishing supply chain there. The event we did 2 days ago was heavily on supply chain. This one's a little bit more on manufacturing. And this is really about your operational structures, right? Whether it's contract manufacturing, you're having your own operation, shelter company acquisition. So we're going to be getting into those topics today. Again, for those who have signed up, if you have questions, please feel free to send them to us and we'll get them answered. So we'll turn over now to the list of questions that we've got. These are the ones that kind of came forward. And again, please feel free to ask additional questions. Generally, we can't always get to the questions. We get to a lot of them. If we can't get to yours, we'll follow up with a phone call or an email in the next 48 hours. So starting off with the first one, setting up your company's operating structure in Mexico. Dan and Jacob, we had talked about that a little bit. We jotted down a few notes, just kind of get started. But Dan, if you would tackle that one first.
Sure. Again, the main options that companies would look at would be to, outsource the manufacturing to a contract manufacturing versus setting up your own operation. And then the third area is a shelter company, which is a bit unique to Mexico, and it's essentially a Mexican entity in place that provides you space, back office support, and will hire manufacturing employees on your behalf. You're responsible for investing in equipment. You're responsible for training the workforce and providing the technical component and management of them. But it provides essentially a space and a corporate framework for you to enter in. So you're not faced with the added complexity of setting up a new entity or developing the back office support that you need to run the company. It allows you to focus on the manufacturing. Joint ventures are certainly an option. if you identified potential partners that seems to be a fit between your business and theirs, and again, it speeds generally will speed the process of getting in place and up and running, and then certainly likewise acquisition. So some companies look at acquiring similar operation or one that they can bolt onto their existing. Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, that pretty much covers it. You know, there's different options depending on your need for speed and the scale of your operations. You know, shelter is definitely the fast one, and you know, contract manufacturing a little bit slower, and then owning your own manufacturing facility definitely takes some time to get up and running.
Certainly. Okay, if we look at the second question, we're talking about here, the questions you'd like to ask, questions should you ask about determining about how to approach your company's operations in Mexico. And we had talked a little bit in advance about that question, and with the idea that we could come up with some of the questions, but Jacob, if you'd start off with this. We've got some of the answers down there, and then we know them more. Jacob?
Do you want me to? I'll take it over.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you should look at when you're considering how you're going to set up your business and your business structure. One is, of course, the size of your business and the scale of your business. Is it going to be a small facility with only 20 or 50 people, or is it going to be a large scale facility that needs 1,000 people? Is it simple assembly work, or is it highly technical manufacturing that you need a lot of technical staff that have very specialized skills? What industrial sector are you in? If you're in certain industrial sectors, there's going to be a lot more supply of labor and a lot more supply of other supporting factories in certain areas of Mexico. So you might want to pick locations near the other people in that industry. A big question for a lot of people that have been manufacturing in China for many years is they have been outsourcing their manufacturing, and they do not have really the capability to manufacture on their own anymore, because they've handed that off to a Chinese supplier, and the Chinese supplier has made the last few designs. So then they've kind of lost the ability to manufacture. So if you want to recover from that, it's going to take a lot of resources to build up engineering capabilities and those in-house, and making sure that you have all the designs and everything up to date, so you could actually manufacture the product yourself if it's even possible. Where's your market? If your market is in Asia, then maybe staying somewhere else in Asia is better. But if your market's the US, like a lot of companies, then Mexico gives you very good access to the US market. Another issue is, depending on the industry you're in and what you're manufacturing, there can be a large percentage of the items that you need for your manufacturing that will only be able to be sourced in Asia. So is it practical to move that to Mexico, or is that just a minor thing that we just need to ship some parts into Mexico and then the rest of it can be done locally within Mexico? Do you have access to capital to set up a manufacturing operation? And what is your capital, what is your potential for investment look like? Can you afford to set up your own facility? Is a shelter maybe a cheaper option for you? You don't have the money. Can you find a contract manufacturer that's willing to do your type of product in Mexico? And then the big one is, since a lot of people have outsourced stuff to Asia, when they moved their manufacturing to Asia, maybe they had a large design team and a large engineering team, but now they're running on a skeleton crew, and you may need to increase the number of engineers and design people you have to have the resources in-house to be able to support a new manufacturing facility. And and Dan, any other comments you have on that?
Yeah, I do. I can't emphasize enough the point you make about the manufacturing know-how, the up-to-date design specifications, current suppliers that you maybe are doing work with in China, having that background, because we talked to a number of clients that really have lost that ability, or at least don't have a grasp of many of the details or product enhancements that have gone on. So that is really key, and it gets time consuming and expensive in many cases to try to reverse engineer what you've got and develop a technology package that would be suitable to go to a contract manufacturer. The other one was, Jacob, you mentioned sourcing components. In many cases, companies will be very difficult, if not almost impossible, to relocate sourcing of some items and materials from Asia to North America, particular. And so what that leads to is an evaluation of the local content in your product if you move it to Mexico. And if you cannot generate, if a majority of the cost of manufacturing that is not domestic in Mexico, that would include labor and operating cost overheads as well as materials, then you'll have a difficult time you won't be able to avoid tariffs when you send that product to the US. You'll be faced with essentially a similar tariff situation producing in China. So that's one of the early things that needs to be addressed, is an understanding of what the value add is in Mexico to ensure that you won't be faced with tariffs on the export into the US.
All right, that's excellent. Thank you for that. And I know we've got several clients who are now helping establish in Mexico. And yes, I agree 100% with the idea about, do you have internal capabilities to assist them? Does a company that's going to Mexico have the capabilities to have people who can be there and have the engineering team who can support this? So it is quite a bit of work. All right, if we're looking at kind of these additional questions, one of the questions that pop up constantly is around the site selection work, right? And that's really on question 3 about where you're going in Mexico. Because if you're not getting the site right, or you're not getting where the suppliers are supposed to be, or the location right, then all the other work you're going to do after that never fixes the site problem, right? Again, the train's got to be pointed in the right direction. So Dan, why don't you take answer some questions around site 3 about specifically where to go in Mexico, and more specifically, where the metrics should you be using to go forward? And we've jotted down a couple of them here, but there are many more.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Certainly, what industry you are in, and more specifically, are there clusters of similar or like manufacturing or complementary manufacturing within Mexico? A few examples of that would be, medical devices. That there's a strong established cluster of those manufacturers in the northwest part of the country. So if you're in that space, that would be a good indication of where to look. Automotive is somewhat scattered around the country, so that there's opportunities there. Others in aerospace clusters are being developed in the central part of the country. So looking at which industry and marrying that up to manufacturing centers in the country is a good first step. Scale of your manufacturing. Smaller operations can be so you've got many more options or much flexibility. If you need significant amount of space, certainly. then you probably will be looking in areas that are less developed at this point. Some very popular areas, you're starting to run out of space around the Monterey area, and you're starting to see increased costs there. So the size and scale of a factory, it will determine where you go, and also the availability of, for example, existing space. Unusual to find new construction of factory space or warehousing space that's much larger than 150,000 square feet. Anything much larger than that is likely going to have to be a build-to-suit operation. So that could, again, impact your choice. I mentioned supplier base. If you're in the stamping, metalworking, machining, casting, if that's a significant part of your requirements, then Mexico is a great place for that. And there's a number of options. Injection molding components is another area. But if you're, if you need your major material supplies from the process industries, for example, steel industry, paper, petrochemicals, less developed manufacturing sector in Mexico. And so, again, that's a key consideration. And then utilities. The cost of utilities in general are higher in Mexico, 10 to 20% nominally. The cost to run power and get connected to the grid is a big surprise for people. That's quite expensive and excessive in Mexico to be aware of. Natural gas is not widely available throughout the country, so you have to, if you're a large gas, you would be a large gas consumer, that can somewhat limit you to Northeast primarily and a bit on the East Coast. So those are a couple of things that we look at. Now, labor, in addition to this, labor availability, skill set of the labor that you need. Are you looking for basic labor or higher skilled technicians? The number of engineers that you're going to need certainly would be another significant issue that we talk to clients about. Others, Jacob?
That's pretty much covering it. I'm just thinking a lot about industry. Industry kind of drives a lot of things, and if you're in certain industries, you'll tend to go towards certain areas. And then also beyond that, if you are in an industry that maybe has overlap with like the automotive industry, then you might want to avoid areas where all the automotive is at, because that will drive up your salary rates and make other things more expensive. So there's kind of a double-edged sword there that you can also look at as, because certain industries are in certain areas, maybe you want to avoid that because you want to avoid the competition for employees. And maybe you want to go to other areas because it's more suitable for your industry.
Good point. Good point. You were talking about the industry sectors and where they are, like in Dan, I know we recently did a project in the medical space. All that was really around Tijuana, which is where that traditional medical manufacturing industry in Mexico has been set up initially to serve Southern California. Now it's greatly expanded that. Well, why don't we take a look at question number 4 about the factors when you're considering to compare and contrast within areas of Mexico. And we had talked about it. We had Jacob, I was going to let you kind of address that. You were talking earlier about the factors you would consider when you're contrasting the different areas within Mexico. If you would talk briefly about that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's different things in different areas of Mexico, and if you're really dependent on the U.S. market and you need short time to delivery, you're kind of stuck into the border zone. If you can afford to have higher delivery times, you might want to consider other industrial zones more in the center of Mexico, in the Querétaro area, in Mexico City area, Puebla area, where there's a lot of industrial stuff. And then, also if you're looking at, electronics, if you're in electronics, you're going to be drove more towards like Guadalajara, where there's a lot more electronics industry. However, a lot of the electronics industry left that area in the last 20, 30 years. Although it's coming back, it is moved more towards IT stuff. So then there's other things that you want to look at.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we had talked earlier, really, when we're sitting up and down there, it really depends. There's so many things about what you need for your own facility, and then figuring out what's in Mexico, whether you need certain utilities, right? Whether you need certain aspects of certain skilled labor do you need for facility, and then you begin to go evaluate those, identify those sites in Mexico. Dan, is there anything you would add? Dan?
Yes. You know, the idea of safety and security, we get a lot of questions on that. And so certainly, depending on the company's comfort with Mexico, with the security aspects of it, that may make a larger or may have a higher weighting. Certainly, it's a concern. People have that concern, but it's generally we haven't seen clients have any significant issues around that. And certainly there are where there are options that you really don't have worries about security. Because one thing, you know, we've talked a bit about a number of different considerations. Important point is to go through an exercise early on in the process and determine what are the key factors that you need for your business, and what are the must-haves and then the nice-to-haves, and appropriate weighting on them to help develop a structure to make that decision. Okay.
Good. All right. Well, that makes pretty good sense. And when you talk about to make your decisions, I think we were talking about different operating instructions. Let's talk now about contract manufacturers, specifically number 5, about the preparation information you need to evaluate your products for contract manufacturers. Dan, I'll let you kind of tackle that. There's some of the answers we had come up with. We know there are more, but those are some of the initial ones.
Yeah, and these are, we had hit on these a bit earlier on the need to have complete design specification and understanding of how a product is produced, and to determine, again, to make sure you've got adequate in-house resources to coordinate a project with a domestic contract manufacturer in Mexico. When you look at that contract manufacturing space, well developed particularly on the electronics and electrical equipment assembly, with large well-known names, Foxconn, for example, Flex. They're well established in Mexico and very large operations, and with multiple operations around the country. Big assembly operations, well established and a good fit for contract manufacturing. But it's not China. It's not the you don't have the breadth of companies or the number of companies that are particularly focused on contract manufacturing sector. And I think, Jacob, you might be able to talk a little bit about that. Your companies are not really focused on that space. They're more manufacturing for their internal use rather than what you would see in Southeast Asia or China. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely agree, because you know in Mexico it's not a lot of companies that are in the business of, we set up a facility to manufacture for someone else. We're either manufacturing our own thing, or we're manufacturing something that maybe we supply to other local manufacturers, but they're not in the normal business. Like if you go to a Chinese supplier and say, we need this subassembly made, and they will say, okay, we'll build that. We understand how it basically works. We can start sourcing all the local subcomponents and everything else, and they'll do that for you. In Mexico, that's not very likely to happen. If you have a subassembly that has a lot of components, you're probably going to have to help the supplier to source those components, because they're going to consider that that's your job, and we can maybe do some assembly work, or we can make one or two of the components. But we're in the business of supplying those components, not in the real business of outsourcing all of your production for it.
Yes, and a recent project that I was involved in, that that contrast was very apparent. Identified very capable contractor for electrical and mechanical assembly, and outsourced a pretty significant piece of work and equipment, but the amount of support they needed to identify sources of the basic components they would need to use, we had to provide a great deal of support for that. Again, they were comfortable sourcing materials for their own use, but really didn't have a well-developed procurement arm that could support. So we had provided a significant amount of support on that.
Yeah, Jacob, that's a very good point. Yeah, I don't think most people are counting Mexico or looking at Mexico. They're not thinking about that, right? They're not looking at that as a situation. That's why those manufacturers set up differently than China or Vietnam, Thailand, India, Poland, any of the other places we're operating. Okay, if we're looking at on 6 about contract manufacturing, and then before we turn to establish your own operation or shelter, how is contract manufacturing is used primarily for our clients that don't want to have the same level of risk in China, aren't comfortable, or in Mexico, aren't comfortable establishing an operation there. Jacob or Dan, do you all see contract manufacturing? What other areas in which you see companies looking at contract manufacturing as a better option than establishing their own or setting up a shelter?
It can definitely work if you're in an industry or you're in a sector that there is sufficient suppliers of contract manufacturers. But if you're outside of those areas, it can be very, very difficult, because you're not going to be able to identify anyone that's going to be willing to do the contract manufacturing. They will be more suitable to just only supply you components, but it's your problem to figure out how to assemble them together or do a lot of the other parts.
Yeah, you agree 100%. Dan, you add anything to that?
One thing that relatively low complexity, high labor input can be a good fit. And when you get into, and I mentioned sort of electronic contract manufacturing, companies like Foxconn, that's a good fit. Electrical, mechanical assembly, box build sort of stuff, wire harnesses, those things are all well established and a very good fit. But when you get some more complex manufacturing, finding appropriate contracts for that work can be a real challenge.
Agreed. So if you looked at contract manufacturing, then you start looking at manufacturing your own shelter companies. One of the questions we had from one of the registrants was about prepping themselves for the information they would need if they were going to set their own manufacturing operation up or their own shelter company. So I wanted to kind of talk through that if we could. Dan, why don't you start us off here? We put down some notes already for people to think about, but if you would hit those and also hit the additional ones.
Sure. We've talked a bit previously about internal resources. Setting up your own facility is going to be will be a it will be a complex project. And so do you have people that you can dedicate to that work? We found projects that we've run into difficulty because the client resources are 10% here, 20% here. Really, for something like this, you need a clear, defined, dedicated staff to support it. We've talked about having product design, but you also need to have a fair amount of detail and thought put into what sort of building and space requirements, utility requirements, along to support your new factory operation. And so it's a different skill set than on product engineering, certainly. And level of automation is another thing. So conversation within a client to say, okay, are we going to replicate what we have now, or are we looking to improve, go to best practices around automation and for example, automation, energy efficiency, those sorts of things. And the mathematics of that, the costing of that is different in Mexico than in the US. So at lower labor rates, you may be faced with weighing between automation and adding staff and adding people. So that's a little different calculation in Mexico than what you may be faced with in the US. When you're thinking about startup support, transition design, construction, startup support, and then ramping that facility up, it's a very long commitment of people who will support that. Typically, we see is from startup of a newer facility, relatively, let's say, a medium to large size facility startup, of that to achieving full design capacity and quality, it's 12 to 18 months. So that's a long time between setup of the factory into the really full independent production. It could be 2 years easily if you're building. And so that kind of support can be challenging to find people to commit to that. And then again, being able to the amenities and infrastructure on the ground near your factories, be able to support an expatriate staff there is a critical consideration. And around the labor points, obviously, what kind of people will you need? Will you need higher skilled technicians? Will you need a number of engineers? Is it going to be a very complex supply chain that you'll have? And will you need more higher level supply chain management capability, which is a really limited skill set in Mexico, and one that people really have a challenge sourcing people to support the operation. Critical consideration. Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones that always comes up to me, I think is quite important is kind of the first one that you talked about. Do you have the people internally that can support this project? What will you have to grow your organization a little? Because maybe 30 years ago, when you moved your production to China, you had a very large engineering design team. So, but now after the years, you've outsourced a lot of that. So you have now more of a skeleton crew of operations people, of design people, of engineering. So you're going to have your people more available, and you're going to need probably more resources and more support to get the factory up and running. Just because this has been a trend in the way that a lot of U.S. companies have moved as they've outsourced a lot of the stuff to China. They've downsized the technical abilities within their company. So to support a new facility, you're going to have probably more resources also.
Fair point. We've seen that on a couple occasions, right, where they've had to expand the engineering team, the engineering department that they currently had. If we're looking at, say, what this question was asked, and so we put it down here about number 8, about keys to establishing a business relationship with the Mexican manufacturers. And the question was asked to us by one of the registrants. It's a little vague, but we put it down and tried to answer it. Dan, why don't you tackle that, particularly contrasting with from if you're dealing previously dealt with China manufacturing and what's it like now dealing with Mexican manufacturers?
Sure. General themes would be around relationships. It takes time and effort to establish a relationship. A lot of it should be face to face. It should be at the appropriate level. Suppliers or manufacturers, contract manufacturers or key suppliers generally don't respond well to sort of general emails or phone inquiries. You really have to work a little harder to establish yourself and establish your credibility as a potential client, and take the time and effort to meet, visit, and talk. And that's significantly different than establishing a business relationship in China. You get to that point in China, certainly, but the initial response to inquiries and the general, I guess, level of hunger for new business in Asia tends to be higher than what you see currently in Mexico now, because there is such an interest in manufacturing there. And the opportunities that suppliers or contract manufacturers see now are much higher than they've been in the past, and so they're faced with trying to weed out the serious inquiries from the fishing expeditions. So, Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that helps you build a lot of credibility is making sure that you have good design information, clear design information. It matches your samples. Everything is prepared and organized, because if you try to, approach a supplier and you have a 10-year-old drawing that has a bunch of handwritten notes that there's been changes made, a Chinese supplier will respond to you and consider that. But a Mexican supplier, it's probably not going to happen, because they're just going to see that and they're going to say, you're not serious.
They've been on fire. So many, I mean, I was talking to a Mexican supplier last week who was talking about the fact he gets 100 new requests a week. Well, let's say he's even exaggerating that about 50%. I mean, they're getting so many requests now, especially people trying to diversify from China. I think that's a point well taken, Jacob, that you've got to be crisp and clean, because they're looking for volumes, they're looking for less complexity. They want to run the high volume stuff. And you may not always be able to provide that. So you've got to at least have you've got to have your stuff in order and be ready to go, because they've got so many other options. If you're looking at Mexico, both for contract manufacturing or for establishing your own manufacturing facility or sourcing, we talked about some of the product categories where we know they're available in Mexico, and they're good fits for Mexico. And we're talking about some that are not. Jacob, if you would tackle this, we've got kind of put down 7 of them just to get the list started.
Yeah, I think we mentioned some of these. The ones on the left, basically, these are very common and available in Mexico, and the ones on the right are much more difficult in Mexico. Medical devices, there's specific regions where the medical device suppliers are, so there's good support there. Automotive, there's a couple regions where there's a good supply of automotive related suppliers. Also with metal casting, stamping, forging, stuff like that, there's several regions that are good, and a lot of that is down because of the automotive industry, and then just other supporting industries that they're supplying to. And then electronics assembly, electronic equipment assembly. Also, there's a decent amount of that. But when you get into like semiconductors, there's very, very limited or maybe no options. Processing industries, if you're talking about steel, you're talking about paper, petrochemicals, you just don't have a whole lot of options, and the price might not make it very attractive. And then if you go into electronic components, especially simple electronic components, a resistor, a transistor, some computer chips, a lot of that stuff is just done in Asia. There's just not a lot of suppliers that can do it in Mexico.
Yeah, we're seeing so many of our clients, electronic sector, we're moving to Mexico, we're moving to Thailand, to Vietnam. They're still having to use, and they will for a long time, their supply chain base out of Mexico. I mean, their supply chain base out of China. It's too difficult to qualify and get, and oftentimes they don't produce it nearly at the same price China has it. So, Jacob, fair point on the electronic side. Dan, would you add anything more to that?
Injection molded components, plastics injection molding, primarily, but also extrusion, general plastic processing. I would say in terms. One thing that comes up often is around simple product assembly. That's a great fit, particularly along the border where you can get close, where you don't need a high level of skill and you can develop that capability internally. Certainly. Yep.
Dan, one thing you lead the EWA chemical practice. Can you talk a little bit about the chemical business in Mexico, or the lack of it in Mexico versus like a
very well established distribution network for chemical and similar, the chemical industry, especially chemicals in particular, but not much manufacturing. Your manufacturing and your suppliers are going to be producing in the U.S. Primarily, although many Asia chemical manufacturers, polymer manufacturers, colorants have set up good distribution networks in the country. So again, you're going to be faced with importing those materials, but it's not necessarily an inhibitor because of proximity. So much of the chemical manufacturing base is Texas based in the Southeast, and so the logistic challenges there and costs are not as excessive as you might think.
Yeah, good point. Well, let's move on. We've got a limited amount of time here. We're trying to get in some more questions. Jacob, Dan, talk a little bit about setting up a factory in Mexico, right, and the amount of different times. If you're looking at your own facility versus a shelter operation or setting up a contract manufacturing, but talk about the times of setting up those different structures. Jacob, why don't you tackle that first, if you would?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different options, and if you're doing a shelter operation, then it's going to be fairly quickly because the legal structure is already there, the facility is already there. You got to bring in probably some equipment depending on what your manufacturing process is, but sometimes that can be done as little as 2 or 3 months. If you're setting up your own facility, I mean, it really depends on what industry you are, the scale, what kind of equipment you need. You could be talking from a year to 2 or 3 years, depending on the complexity of your manufacturing. If you're doing your own facility, if you're doing something suitable for contract manufacturing, also it can be quite fast because they already have the facility set up. If it's just simple assembly, it's just the time to reroute the materials, start sourcing locally, and that can take time, but it's fairly quickly it can happen. And then like anything of a joint venture or an acquisition, you're definitely talking about some serious time because you're going to have to do all your due diligence and everything else before you move forward.
You know, you working on that project, the steel project, how much time did you all have allocated for setting up a new facility in Mexico, new plant? Jacob?
Sorry?
I'm sorry, you had worked on that project we were talking about setting up a steel facility, I believe, in Mexico.
Yeah,
How much-
and
how much
that's
time
more of a
did you allocate
3-year
to the work?
process. Yeah, that was much more of a 3-year process because it was fairly large facility. They're going to have to bring in a lot of specialty equipment, and then just get it. Because of the size of it, you're going to have to buy the land. You're going to have to custom build your facility, and all of that's going to take time. So it's looking at about a 3-year project to make that happen.
Yeah. Dan, would you add anything to that about setting up the times for contract manufacturing, sourcing, shelter?
Yeah, one consideration is interesting, I think, is that equipment, sourcing equipment for a new operation can, particularly these days with long lead times, can be a pacing factor to get up and running. One of the advantages of Mexico versus some other countries we do work in is it's more simple and straightforward to relocate used equipment from an existing facility into Mexico. And so what you often find in Asia, certainly in China, Vietnam, that we've dealt with recently, is getting used equipment through customs can be a challenge. You normally go through a process to bring in a third party to evaluate the equipment, the condition of it, and develop a market price of it to base. It's generally used to base import duties on. Those are you can get around requirements in Mexico, and it's quite common for companies to import used equipment into their new facility, either a new factory or a new shelter operation, or to provide that equipment to a contract manufacturer. So that can speed things up significantly. So that's one point to highlight there.
Yeah,
one thing that I did want to mention is with the shelter facilities, a lot of shelter facilities, if you're growing a bigger facility, they're considered more of a temporary thing if you're growing a bigger facility. So you can start up very quickly in a shelter facility, but then later on move out into your own facility, preferably in the nearby area, because you want to keep with the same employees and everything else. But that can be a mix of how you do both your own facility and a shelter facility to get into the country quickly and get manufacturing up and running quickly.
And what's the downside, Jacob, when you talk about the pluses and minuses? What's the downside generally of a shelter?
I mean, the one is you're relying on them a lot. So once you get out on your own, you're going to have a little bit of a difficult time, managing your own finance, managing your own HR, managing a lot of things that they're taking care of for you. So it's going to make it when you leave, you're going to have a big increase in employees and people, the skills that you need to have available for when you start running your own operations. But and it's a trade-off, because a shelter facility will be a little bit expensive because you're getting convenience and you're getting speed, so that will cost you.
Sure, it certainly does. Certainly does. And it's really got to be a numbers game to understand if it's worth it, right? Well, Dan, your comment around the equipment was a good one. That kind of was part of the answer for number 11, so you kind of jumped us forward, which is good. Dan and Jacob, I'll just turn to final question number 12. I think that Dan, if you would take that, or Jacob, I think obviously you got to have locals on the ground there. But Dan, Jacob, if you would give your answer on that, Dan, same.
Yeah, I would, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I mean, at the beginning, you're going to need support from your management team from U.S. or Mexico or China or wherever you're now currently manufacturing, and you're going to need those people, with your facility for a year, 2 years to get everything up and stable. And then after that, yeah, you can go more to a local management team. So you really do need to hire both, and it's kind of each company's opinion, or depends on what industry and how complex they're doing it, whether they hire that guy right away or do they wait on until things are up and more stable before they start hiring that person and then start transitioning to the new guy.
Got it. Dan, you agree with that?
Yeah, and I would say one of the advantages in this scenario with Mexico is proximity to the U.S. So as you go through a process of starting up your factory and staffing it, and then localizing the management team, you're close enough. Generally, you're close enough to headquarters in the U.S. so you can get support for that new management, that local management team. A company expanding in Mexico from China or Korea or Japan, more challenging. They can't get people in and out of there as quickly and as easily as you can from the U.S. So that's a consideration.
Well, look, I know we've gone a little over the time, but I appreciate everyone staying with us. I want to just conclude today's webinar. I want to thank Dan McLeod and Jacob Miller for coming on and sharing their expertise on the ground in Mexico, the process that we're doing it every day in Mexico. And we see Mexico only continuing to grow in interest for companies. Given last week's election, and then we know what's coming on the tariff side, and we know it's not getting better. It's going to get higher tariffs. There's obviously a greater increase in Mexico and Southeast Asia. So if you have any questions outside of today's webinar, please feel free to drop us a note. You all will have a survey that's going to show up. If you would take the time to answer the survey and send that back to us, that'd be most appreciated. Again, we appreciate you taking the time, and please feel free to drop us an email if you have any questions. Take care and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.